Graham Watson, please, welcome.
Thank you. Relatively small brand. I'm doing something a little different than some would do in that I do not have a brand new product to preview. However, some of my modules came out during pandemic times and never really got a proper introduction, so I decided this was an opportunity to show everything working together. And I'll give a quick overview just for those who haven't seen it in the past of an older module that I'll be using in the demonstration as well. So working from past to present, I offer a 2-channel tube distortion, which uses a Korg new tube inside, individual controls for each channel. There is a tilt filter before the gain stage, which can act alternately as a bass boost and treble cut, or vice versa, as a treble boost and bass cut. Feedback loop per channel, wet-dry mix per channel, tube bias control for waveform symmetry, and both the bias and the wet-dry mix for each channel can be individually voltage controlled, and the voltage, plate voltage switch is the only global control. It will starve the tube and send it directly into clipping. So it gives the module more range from either a smoother saturation up to hard clipping, fuzz, self-oscillation, spitting, screaming, should you need that sort of thing. Next in the lineup, one of the newer modules is a three-part crossfade array. 4 inputs. Each pair of inputs goes to side crossfaders, which are internally sent to the center crossfade. So at its simplest, it is a 4-to-1 crossfader, which is helpful for any sort of morphing textures in audio. It's an interesting alternative to a mixer between, say, 1 or 2 VCOs and a filter. Of course, voltage control of each stage is independent. I add something a little unique in that there are control voltage pass-throughs. So if you use an external CV, this will repeat that signal post-attenuator, and if you're not using an external CV, it will output plus or minus 2 or 5 volts, corresponding to the manual movement of the control. One thing I should have mentioned just a moment ago, in addition to the 4-to-1 feature, it is also includes the direct outputs from the side crossfades. So it is useful for feedback patching, more complex routing of effects. You can have dry, wet mixes of either multiple effects, or perhaps you have a delay with multiple taps, and you can go wet to dry from each tap. It is also DC coupled, and while I'm not using it in this capacity today, it's very good for blending LFOs, envelopes, other modulations into more complex modulators. And finally, we have a pair of modules which I'll try to spread the cables a little more. It's a macro controller with 4 channels. It is suitable for audio or CV, of course. Individual attenuators at each input. The inputs are normaled, so you could use it either to distribute perhaps only one modulator to 4 different locations, or in this case, I'm using it as an internal normal for 5 volts, and I'll just use it as a manual control for 4 different controls on another module later. The other one is patched with 4 separate LFOs. They maintain their independent signal paths and get a master fader level, which controls them as a group. So it's a good way of streamlining complex modulations, which I'll talk about in just a moment more what I've patched with these today. I like to do a lot of FM, AM, phase mod sorts of patches for drones and harsh noises, and it's a good way to consolidate what becomes otherwise a very cluttered patch and give you hands-on instrument level control instead of just letting everything run wild. One more element of that to mention is that there is an optional expander which adds mutes to each channel and offsets to 2 of the channels. So quick note about the patch. I'm using a 3-body triple oscillator. Some of the internal normalization I have overridden with one of the crossfade arrays, which will either send the outer oscillators here to modulate the center, or it will select from two generate threes over in the secondary case. And so I can morph the modulators going to the main carrier, and then that is all going out to a second crossfader, which allows me to select whether we're actually listening to the side modules or the center, some combination thereof. And the center output of the first crossfade is going to amplitude modulate the main crossfade on the second. And on the first, the side outputs are going to each of these side oscillators so that we can have the generate threes modulate the sides or the center, some combination thereof, and then these can go back into the center as well. The macro controllers in this case allow me to have a single control for 4 LFOs, which are controlling depth of modulation on this crossfader as well as depth of modulation on the other macro controller. And there's a similar setup which is off camera between the generate threes, which is then feeding over to this. So it's 3 crossfaders and 2 macro controllers involved. So without further talk, make some odd noises.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Great sound. I have the idea it's like balanced chaos. Is it a little bit the idea of controlling the frequency modulations?
Yes, there's several routings of phase mod and frequency mod, and then one thing I was doing with this crossfader was audio rate crossfading between the two sides, which is maybe a strange cousin of ring mod. It's not 4-quadrant, of course, so it's an interesting way to blend two textures together and generate sidebands based on whatever those waveforms are. So what I like to do is have maybe a simpler waveform on one side of each crossfade and a more complex on the other. So then you're just juggling all of these. Where have I put simple things? Where have I put complex things? And
It was
maybe I have
interesting.
2 octaves to work with.
It was really quite interesting to follow the beats of the tunings. Nice to have you here, and welcome back then. Thank you.